a lot of what you heard from Aileen and I about was these nice sort of indicators and things that we can measure going forward. And today is really not about dismissing that or segregating it, but looking at it from a different perspective, which is from the story of place, which is kind of this fantastically organic description of who we are and how we evolved, and then looking at our potential through that lens. And so, without giving much of it away, I'm going to turn it over to Carol Sanford, who's going to walk you through the setup for it and launch us into a really fun discussion.
And you actually are having fun with it now, right?
I love it.
That's great. So as Tara said, last time I introduced all of you to the experience a little bit of Story Place. We worked with stories. We worked with answering questions which were related to, why do we live here? What do we see the unique patterns? While we've been doing all of that, there's been a team from Regenesis, who you heard two of over here earlier, Ben and Joel, who've been out interviewing a lot of people and doing a lot of research and digging into who you are as a way to bring something back today. But I want to tell you why I think it's so important to what we're doing. Because, I'm an economist and I do a lot of work with communities and economic development, and I got to understanding how important today is through my own struggles and own discovery patterns. I, as an undergraduate, studied economics, and it was microeconomics. I was always interested in what happens on the ground where you can touch things, right? As opposed to macroeconomics, where who knows, right? How that stuff works and how the world changes. But I also studied political science, but it was about the governance process and how it is we make decisions in government. But I went on to graduate school, as I said this morning, because I couldn't figure out what I was going to do with this, because they felt conflicting in some ways, and ended up studying business and also urban planning. And then I taught at California State University at San Jose for several years. And it was amazing because of all these different things I'd studied, I ended up being a part of a program of research and teaching collaboratively that worked with bringing together the business school, the urban planning school, and what was then called cybernetic systems. They're now called information technology systems. What was shocking as we started studying what made things work in economic development was that we discovered a series of things that were really important to avoid a lot of the challenges you get in economic development. So if you were to think for just a minute, and I'll just ask you for a couple of shout outs here, what would you say is the biggest challenge with trying to lead a community to be really healthy, vital, and economically successful? What are the major challenges?
Well, having a strategic direction.
So having a direction we all agree on, and we all said we're going to go there and get everybody aligned to it. What else? Challenges you feel like. You're trying to help lead school and education, right? You're trying to lead understanding through institutes and museums. What do you run into that makes it really hard? Apathy, resources, right? So apathy, sometimes people we don't know whether they don't care, but they don't all care about the same thing, so you certainly can feel like we have apathy. We're challenged for getting the resources to pull off what we want. So we found these same things. The other thing we found, if you get enough of a historical perspective, is that you got in most communities around the world, and certainly we were looking mostly in the US and North America, you got more volatility than you like. So do you ever experience any big drop suddenly in what you can sell housing for, and what you can do in terms of businesses being viable, how many go out, how many storefronts you get empty, and then all of a sudden you can get a growth period and you have these great climbs. And then, a handful of years later, a dozen years later, you're suddenly on the other side of that and you're on a downslope. This boom and bust, anybody experienced that here over the years? A little bit. Yeah, right? And would you like to have a little less of that? So those were the things we were looking at, and we discovered three critical things, which I did not put on a slide, but as I said, I'll write these up, that are critical to why we're doing what we're about to do right now, and why Joel's about what he's going to offer. As we looked at communities that maintained their viability through up and down cycles, their vitality, which meant they could attract funds, resources, people cared and wanted to be there, and were able to evolve through time, we found three things that were critical. So you don't have to write these down, but you can if you want. The first one is that they knew who they were distinctively. They were not trying to copy somebody else. They were not saying things like, we're going to be the, the Paris of Texas, or the, the Bourguignon region of California. They didn't say that. They were finding who they were distinctively and uniquely, and they did that not by deciding what they would be, but in the interviews and the research we did, we found that they did it by revealing who they were. They really looked at, who are we? Not how we're going to decide. So there were people who, during those periods, were deciding in kind of an arbitrary, like Bangalore, India, said, we're going to be the call center of the world. Now, you probably couldn't find a lot of call centers if you went way back in the history. And pretty soon, the call center of the world was moving from Bangalore to, I'm not sure where it actually ended up in China. It was more around Beijing. So it moved. So it wasn't their distinctiveness. They did the same thing in Dublin. We're going to be the cheapest circuit board makers. We're going to own that. Well, that didn't hold up too well. So the first thing you have to do is really figure out who you are, and you become more like, when you think of Paris and the Metroplex of Paris, do you have a strong sense of who they are? Yeah. I mean, when we go to Paris to visit, or we think about them, they know who they are, and they actually build their economic development patterns off of their story. Portland, Oregon, and the Metroplex of Portland does the same thing. Boston does the same thing. They don't have arguments about who they are. They are who they are. And those communities during the downturn this last 5 years had much less drop. Austin, Texas, the same thing. So part of what we got to get is this clarity about who we are. Second, we have to develop a narrative that people resonate with, which makes really clear what that distinctiveness is. It can't be just that we know it. When I say, do you know what Paris is? Yeah. You have to develop a narrative that you can tell others and that you can make a part of messaging. And I've done a lot of that kind of work with people, but I never, ever understood the power of it until I met Regenesis, whom you're going to meet. And the capacity to, because to do that first work, you actually have to have on your team biologists, naturalists, people who can read geological patterns, people who can read economic patterns, and to be able to see through all of the threads. And also not decide they know, but draw it out of people because it's there. So the second thing is you got to create a narrative, and you're going to get a bit of the beginning of that narrative today. And as a group, we're going to work to get it more toward a brand eventually. I mean, I shouldn't say that. We're not going to get that all done by this project, but we're going to create the basis for that. The third thing that you have to be able to do to have a vital ongoing with less volatility is you have to be able to embed that narrative and that uniqueness into everything you do. And what I mean by that, and this is the work that I do with communities, you have to embed into economic development planning the uniqueness of the place and the story. You have to embed it into a brand, which Don and I were talking about earlier, right? It has to be the way you articulate. It has to become an aligned process and an aligning process which everyone can resonate with. It becomes a part of urban planning process. It becomes a part of how you develop businesses. Because once that unique story is known, then you have the place people want to live and work that want that kind of place. So the reason we're doing this is it actually turns out to fulfill the three things it takes for a community to be have more staying power and to pull back all of the uniqueness of who it is and really advance its economic development. So hopefully you'll just sit back and listen. You'll enjoy this. And as I said this morning, right, this is weird. You should expect this to feel a little different than you're used to hearing because we think of stories as what we do at bedtime with our children and grandchildren. This is going to be a different kind of story. And hopefully we're then going to do some exercises to give you a flavor of what it would mean to embed it. We're certainly not going to be able to get very far with that today. We'll get a little further maybe in our January meeting. So I want to introduce to you the amazing man, Joel Glansberg, who is going to come and share this with us. Joel is a naturalist, and he is astounding at being able to see the patterns. I actually want you to meet Ben Hager, too. Ben, if you would stand up. Ben was a part of the team that helped develop the story that we have, you're going to hear about. And Joel's going to do it all in pictures, in a few words.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Tara. I wanted to say a couple of things about how we go about this, because it's really helpful to know. Did a lot of research, reading books, looking online, all the rest. Ben did a lot of interviews over the phone. But just like understanding a person, it's really important to be in the place. So we spent some time looking at the region, going around the region, looking at it. Also, it's really important, just like when you want to understand someone, you ask them to tell you stories from their life. So one of the things we also did was look at the geological history. Because the geology determines a lot about the landscape, what's possible here, in terms of agriculture, where people can travel, where they can't travel, all the rest of that, what the soils are like, everything else. Also, we're going to be talking about things at very different time periods. Because if we were to just understand what was happening in a particular decade or one era of time, it doesn't really tell us about what's lasting throughout time. So what we're constantly looking for is what are the patterns that are in the geological processes, that are in all of the people who have lived here, and all the eras that people have gone through. So this is our region, as you all know, and one of the things that's really striking is it's called the Finger Lakes, even though we know that many of the Finger Lakes are over here, and some people call this region the Genesee Finger Lakes region. So what you call yourself is a story that you're telling. It matters. This is a topographic map of our area, and you can very clearly see how it cuts off all kinds of things that extend beyond these boundaries. So all of those political boundaries cut off social, cultural, ecological systems that were nested in much larger holes, right? Whether those are the Great Lakes or this whole eastern Appalachian region or even the connections to the rest of the state of New York. So one of the major systems we're in is this whole Great Lakes basin, all of the waters of the Great Lakes flowing through Lake Ontario. And the Lake Ontario basin being one of the systems that were nested within, there being the Genesee River, and this all is the headwaters of the Susquehanna, going all the way down to the Chesapeake. So again, this international border is somewhat arbitrary. The Ontario Basin, the Lake Ontario, is unique because of being at an entirely different elevation than the rest of the whole Great Lakes province. All the other Great Lakes are pretty much at the same elevation, and because Lake Ontario is lower, it's a little bit milder here than it is in the rest of that region. It's a little bit more protected, being nestled as it is against the Allegheny Highlands. Does anybody know where the name Ontario comes from? It's from a Mohawk name, Gane Antalio, which means beautiful lake. Handsome lake. This whole region has been at least two seas. Those ancient seas laid down all the limestone that we have, which helps to buffer the pH of our soils. And in both cases, mountain ranges rose to the east and eroded away and filled in those seas. Another sea started, began, laid down limestone soils, mountain range rose to the east, eroded, and filled in the sea. And that's where we get all these layers and layers of shale. The shale is really important because when it got broken up by the glaciers and other geological processes, it allows great drainage. That's why we can even have a wine industry here. That's why the grapes grow well here. It's one of the reasons why our soils are so good. Following these seas and seas filling in were the glaciers, at least 4 separate glacial events. As you know, they carved the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes, worked the soil some more so that they were even more favorable for agriculture. And very importantly, they carved a lot of the things in the landscape. So as this 5,000 feet, mile-high chunks of ice started to melt, all that meltwater had to go somewhere. The St. Lawrence River Valley was full of ice, so it had to go between the Adirondacks and the Catskills, and it carved the path of the Mohawk River. So if you look at the Mohawk River, it's much smaller than the valley that it lies within, because the valley was in fact carved by all this huge amount of glacial runoff. So that had a huge amount to do with forming the landscape that we find ourselves in, that we've been in for the past tens of thousands of years. So most of our region is within this Great Lakes plain, goes over into the Allegheny Plateau a bit, but you can see that Great Lakes plain extends beyond the boundaries of our region and is connected to this whole Hudson River Valley by that Mohawk lowlands. Mohawk Valley lowlands. So this corridor has been really important since before human beings are here. After the glacier scraped all the plants away, that's how the plants that are here got here, right? They came from both directions, and we'll look a bit more at that. It's how people traveled through, the Mohawk Trail traveling through there, the Erie Canal, the railroads, and up to today, the interstates. You can see that it is the easiest path across the mountains north of way down here. So even though there are passages across the mountains that are at much higher elevation, you have to go up to get over. So that's determined a lot about this place. This kind of constrained passageways on the east, on the west, because of this difference at Niagara that sets Lake Ontario apart from the rest of the Great Lakes. But it's not just a corridor. It's not just like a pipeline. There's this protected lobe of really good soils and a very fruitful area. So as I look at this, as Carol says, I work as a naturalist. So it's a big eddy, right? If any of you are fly fishermen or boaters or anything else, you know that out of the main stream of the river there's protected spots where the water swirls in, and that's where things are attracted to, where things are brought to. It's why the fish hang out there. You don't drop your fly in there, you drop it here and it's brought to the fish. It's also a place where things can settle out, things can take root. They're not in that fast moving water down the middle of the stream. They're able to actually do something. They're able to change. Another way to think about it is like a wetland or a pond. Lake Ontario is literally a place where the fast moving waters of the falls can settle out, can drop out their fertility, things can take root, things can change. Any wetland, any pond, the water that comes out is clearer than the water that goes in for the most part, and all kinds of beings come there to make use of the fertility of the place. Okay. This map is hard to see on this projector, but the soils in this region are very good soils. It tells you how many limiting factors are in the soils. The richest soils in North America are here in the upper Midwest and throughout the central portion of the country. There are some pretty good soils along the eastern seaboard. Those were taken up very early on by the land grants, plantations, all the rest. So this was very much the first large expanse of open, good land that was available to settlement. It's also why the native peoples were able to thrive here. Right? It got opened up after the Revolutionary War, the settlement for the Americans. This is a map of ecoregions. Ecoregion is a place where the climate and the soils and the landforms are suitable for certain plants and animals, certain communities. You can see our region is the far eastern portion of this upper Great Lakes, upper Midwest region, and right where it comes together with the northern portion of the Appalachian Highlands. Some people map it that way, so it's the eastern extent of this ecoregion. Some people are mapping it so it's a kind of western extension of a more easterly region. So again, you have things coming in from both directions. After the glaciers, as I said, all the plants that were here had to come from elsewhere, and you can just see 5 different tree species and their ranges. And we're at the kind of different extremes of the different ranges of the different trees. Things coming in from different directions, mixing in a unique way, and creating something that's not found elsewhere. That pattern again. The native people who were here, as I was saying, we're looking for patterns throughout time. As people, we like to think of ourselves as the masters of our destiny, but we're in fact formed by our places. And that has a lot to do with telling us what's potential. We're also looking for images. So one image that I'm presenting is this idea of an eddy. The Haudenosaunee thought of themselves as the people of the Longhouse. And that Longhouse was actually our region and that Mohawk Valley. So it's literally a shape in the landscape. And that placed them right at this critical point, at the gateway to this whole rich portion of the inner section of the country, right where the French and first the Dutch and then the British were trying to get through to all of this wealth. Okay. So this is the Erie Canal laid on top of the Mohawk Trail, and again the rail lines followed that same path. Even our infrastructure of today, communication infrastructure, followed the same path. The Erie Canal being in that bottleneck in the hourglass of water transportation routes and later rail routes. And population. The black dots are the densest population, and then the gray is the second level of population. You can see there's again this globe surrounding the Finger Lakes. It's not just a corridor through to the Ohio Valley and the upper Midwest. It's a place where all kinds of things came together and settled down. That's why the schools of learning happened here, all the various things with the arts. Things were attracted here, coalesced here, concentrated here, and all kinds of things developed here. We all know of Rochester being called the Flower City. Originally all the mills that were set up here to make use of the water power were sawmills. And then they turned that into the use to grind the grain that was grown throughout what they were calling the Genesee country, throughout the whole region. The industrial base of the city was based upon the products of the countryside. The countryside was dependent upon the city to process their goods as well as sell them and bring them what they needed. So this great reciprocal relationship between the countryside and the city. As things opened up more to the west, it was not as necessary to grow wheat and grind it here, and it became the flower city. So it became literally an area for nurseries, not just in Rochester, but all throughout the Finger Lakes. Miller Nursery still exists down in Canandaigua. And many varieties, particularly of white seedless grapes and apples, were developed here. And all of these varieties of fruits, again, people needed varieties that would do well here. So they had to breed them, but by providing for that local need, then they provided for the needs of all the settlers of the upper Midwest. People needed it there just as much as people needed it a little earlier on here. Okay. Another thing from this region is Jell-O, right, from Leroy. And making use of products from the farms, right? It's made from the leftovers from the cows. And what was unique about Jell-O was a unique way of making gelatin. Before that, it was only a dessert for the rich because it was hugely labor intensive to make gelatin from bones. So it was very much a democratic food stuff, if you will. It first really took off about 1900. They started to make cookbooks of how you use Jell-O, sent salesmen across the country, was advertised on the Jack Benny Show, Lucille Ball Show, and had great popularity in the 50s. And then Bill Cosby was the proponent of chocolate pudding. I remember all of those, right? And now, interestingly enough, Salt Lake City, right? Salt Lake City is where the most Jell-O is sold, and it's in fact the state dessert, and was the official dessert of the Salt Lake City Olympics. And it's chariots of the gods are what? That Mormonism, which also started here, is the population that eats the most Jell-O. Okay. Many of you probably know in Seneca Falls, it was the pump capital of the world. Pumps were not developed there, but it was a technology that was continually developed. You had such a concentration of people working on pumps that they came up with all kinds of different varieties. Everyone was trying to do better than everyone else. There was so much water here that pumping was a great need, right? And then it supplied needs elsewhere. The same thing with the fire engine. In an era when cities were mostly made out of wood, fires were a big deal. So the ability to actually have a pump truck was essential. It's ironic that Seneca Falls burned down, even when they were pump capital of the world. But think about how many fire engines there are around the world now and how essential that is to people's lives. When the Erie Canal was first built, no one knew how to do it. Right? There was no civil engineering in this country. There were no successful canals that had been built. They actually had to go to England to learn what they could from them, and then they had to make a lot of things up. being able to cross the Genesee River with the aqueducts, all the amazing civil engineering feats. And so not only was the Erie Canal providing for an essential need for transportation of goods to build this region, it also taught people how to do civil engineering, both of which then got built on all over the world. Right? The building we're sitting in could not have been built without civil engineering. Also, everything that was tried out, learned originally in England, transported here, further developed in this little nucleus, led to the development of other seaways and canals, locks, all the way up to things like the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Wellington Canal. So, dealing with an important local need, developing technologies from elsewhere to be able to do that, and then those growing from here being of use, being capitalized upon because they are so important all over. Okay. Even the idea of an industrial city fed by water transport, Rochester, Syracuse, these were really some of the first that were then led to the development of Chicago and Detroit. What we think of as American farming, as the United States being the breadbasket of the world, was first pioneered here. As I said, the first large expanse of relatively flat, fertile soils enabled very productive farms that were able to produce a lot of food and export it, as well as feed their local communities. And then that was copied throughout the whole upper Midwest, throughout the whole central portion of it. That's a western New York farm, that's an Iowa farm. And even in the realm of religion, we have that same pattern, that we had so many people coming into the region on the Erie Canal without existing religious institutions. So it was a great fruitful ground. Many religious ideas came in from elsewhere. The Shakers, the Quakers, the whole development of the evangelical camp meeting style, working on conversion, the Methodist Church going from originally circuit riding preachers to churches. And it really led to a lot of the questioning about morality, what it meant to be a good person, which bore fruit in the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, many of the other things that this region is known for. Another thing that was native to this place that sprung out of a need was the Iroquois Confederacy that we were talking last night. It didn't come out of they kind of weren't getting along or they decided they should get together, that it was bad. They were at constant war. The stories that women were killing their babies because they didn't want them to live in that world. So the joining together, the creation of the Great Peace and the Great Law made a huge difference to them. They needed it. One of the primary symbols of that Great Law, of that Great Peace, was a bundle of 5 arrows. That a single arrow is broken easily and a bundle of 5 arrows is hard to break. Both Franklin and Jefferson learned Mohawk, and Franklin is quoted as saying, if a bunch of savages could have such a fine way of governing themselves, certainly we could learn to do the same. The Great Law, you can see at the center, is the Tree of Peace, or the Central Fire. That's the executive branch, the Onondagas. The younger brothers, which is the House, and the elder brothers, which is basically the Senate. And the judiciary was the clan mothers. That's who could place or remove chiefs. And you see the 5 arrows and the eagle on the top of the Tree of Peace reflected in our Great Seal, a bundle of 13 arrows and the eagle. So, an important need being developed for at least 1,000 years before Europeans came, and then spreading out throughout the 13 colonies. And all of that giving birth to the Declaration of Sentiments of women's rights, the abolitionist movement, the suffragette movement, and even the birthplace of Memorial Day. Right? Great valuing of freedom here, of democratic principles, and very proud of those ideas taking root here and spreading elsewhere. And again, all of the women leaders gained great strength from their friendships with women from the Confederacy, who were the only women they were seeing in positions of leadership and power. When we first came here, one of the things that people told us we had to look at was Wegmans. Wegmans is an example of a great business that has been serving the community for a long time, grown organically, as well as made great connections between the countryside and the urban areas. And as we looked more and more, a lot of businesses started here that became national and even international businesses. Western Union, Gannett. I love the French's mustard one. It was originally a flour mill, and they started to then make a niche for themselves, grinding mustard seed, making mustard, and then that spread. And again, you need something to put on those white pots. So let's talk about Kodak for a minute. The story goes that Eastman went on a trip. When he got back, he said, there's got to be an easier way to take pictures. Lugging around plates of glass, lugging around chemicals, it's not conducive to making pictures. So he developed a better way to do it that was affordable and accessible to all people. Originally, the camera had to be sent back. They take the film out, make prints out of it, put new film in, send it back to you. Eventually it had the little rolls of paper on them, the metal ones, the plastic ones that went in the Instamatic. But always it was on how do we make it easier and easier and easier and more affordable for people to capture memories. Kodak obviously developed all the first digital camera technology. There was conflict within the company, and they tried to suppress the digital because they didn't want to drive down their business in the film realm. The first digital cameras that Kodak was producing came with a printer, so you could print out your pictures from your digital photos. People not realizing that people would be happy to just have digital images and not have a need for prints. For a while, Kodak was the #1 seller of digital cameras, but they couldn't do it as cheaply as the Japanese and the Koreans, and they were losing $60 a camera for every camera they sold. It's as bad as farming. Bausch & Lomb had a very different way of looking at things. Bausch & Lomb is still a very successful company. We know them for their optics, soft contact lenses, Ray-Bans. They started as a company that imported monocles. They started to make their own monocles as well as eyeglasses. And what set them apart was they started to use a material called vulcanite, which is a hard rubber, an early plastic, to make the frames for the glasses and the monocles from. So when the Civil War came and gold and tortoiseshell were too expensive, they were the ones on the market with a more affordable product. And the work that they did not invent vulcanite, but the work that they did on vulcanite then enabled it to be used in other industries, the making of pens, jewelry, records, camera bodies, flashlights, dentures. And what they did in the second generation was they figured out how to pour the glass lenses instead of grind them. So they could manufacture high-value optic lenses for much cheaper than if they had to grind them. So that's what set them apart in the second generation. Developed Ray-Bans for the military, mostly for the Air Force. In 1938 they came out with them, and most recently they developed these soft contact lenses. One of the things that's really striking about this story is as they came up with each innovation, whether it's vulcanite or casting lenses or sunglasses or soft contact lenses, they would sell off the previous business. Right? So they no longer make Ray-Bans. They no longer make most optics. They pretty much are an eye health care business now. So you get this pattern of innovation and finding the next innovation, finding the next innovation. Xerox, similar pattern, obviously developing copiers. This was the first small computer developed, right? IBM was making computers the size of this room. And there are three really important innovations in this one. The first one is the whole idea of a personal computer. The whole idea of a computer that could sit on your desk, let alone fit in your pocket. The second one was a screen to interact with. Before this, all computers, you had to type in commands or use computer cards or something like that. And the third one is the mouse, this being the original mouse. Right? So three things that we see on a daily basis that are serving an important need that then was seen as serving important needs all over the world. another local business, Champion, making sportswear. And they developed the first hooded sweatshirt. You see these everywhere now. The first sports bra, reversible t-shirt, and even mesh sports clothing. So every sports team's uniform, all the trucker hats, everywhere around the world. So very democratic need that develop new things to fulfill that need, and then those needs being seen as important elsewhere in the world. So again, this pattern of an eddy in the flow. So an eddy where things are brought together and take root and develop and serve larger systems outside.